My vacation was not supposed to commence with 3 armed security guards hammering on my door at 6 a.m. "You've got 48 hours to be off this property," one of them snarled, thrusting eviction documents toward me. They had no idea I was on the verge of exposing their superior's $2 million blunder. This is not just my struggle. It's a battle for every homeowner who has been unjustly cornered. It had been only 3 months since I inherited my grandfather's cabin at Pinewood Lake, Minnesota. During my youth, I had passed every summer there until the age of 15, when my parents' divorce caused our family customs to fracture into stilted holiday schedules. Grandpa Porter died last winter at the age of 92, and I hadn't set foot in the cabin for almost 2 decades. As a forensic accountant, vacations were a rarity, but following an especially grueling tax season, I concluded it was time to rekindle those childhood memories and inspect my inheritance. The drive north to Pinewood Lake was calming. For 3 hours, I watched as concrete landscapes yielded to farmland and then to thick pine forests mirrored in countless small lakes. I had forgotten the distinct smell of the air here, crisp and alive with the scent of pine sap and lake water. When I finally navigated down the gravel path toward the cabin, a weight lifted from my chest. The familiar curve of the shoreline emerged from the trees, and there it was, the humble A-frame that held a central place in so many of my earliest memories. The cabin was precisely as I recalled. Its knotty pine walls exuded the aroma of campfires and nostalgia. The couch, sagging slightly, was where Grandpa and I had engaged in countless card games on rainy afternoons. The assortment of fishing lures still sat on the mantel, collecting dust. That first evening, I sat on the deck with a beer, observing the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and purple. For the first time in what felt like ages, my shoulders began to relax. I was home. I drifted to sleep envisioning all the improvements I would undertake in the following weeks, replacing the worn deck boards, mending the leaky kitchen faucet, and perhaps even constructing the boat dock my grandfather had always dreamed of. Then came the pre-dawn pounding on my door. 3 men, clad in security uniforms with visibly uncomfortable sidearms, wore expressions that implied they took pleasure in this aspect of their jobs. "Carwin Porter?" the tallest one inquired, looking at a clipboard. "We are representatives of the Pinewood Lake Homeowners Association. This property is in violation of community ordinances and boundary regulations. You are trespassing on HOA land." He presented me with a thick envelope. "You have 48 hours to vacate and remove all personal belongings, or you will face legal action and a $25,000 fine." I stood there in my pajama bottoms, coffee mug in hand, utterly blindsided. "There has to be a mistake," I managed to say. "My grandfather was the owner of this cabin for more than 50 years. The guards simply offered a shrug. "Discuss it with Ms. Clark," the tall one stated as they departed. "The HOA office is open at 9. I watched as they entered a polished white SUV, its side emblazoned with Pinewood Lake Community Association in sophisticated navy letters. This was certainly not the relaxed lakeside community I remembered from my childhood. Still reeling, I made my way down to the small dock that extended from my property into the lake. My grandfather's old rowboat was still there, protected by a tarp. The weathered planks of the dock felt familiar beneath my bare feet. I had passed innumerable hours here with my fishing pole, my legs dangling over the edge, absorbed in my grandpa's stories. How could anyone assert this was not our land? As I pondered this bizarre turn of events, an elderly man approached from the adjacent property. "You must be George's grandson," he remarked, offering his hand. "Shanley Maddox. Your grandpa and I were fishing partners for 40 years. Shanley's weathered face wrinkled with worry as I recounted the morning's incident. He shook his head with a grim expression. "That sounds like Doris Clark's work. She became the head of the HOA 3 years ago and has been on a relentless power trip. She established a high-end development company and has been attempting to drive out all the original cabin owners. Your grandfather resisted her fiercely before his health started to fail." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Between us, I suspect that's what ultimately wore him down." I dedicated the remainder of the morning to examining the eviction papers, attempting to decipher the legal terminology that seemed intentionally convoluted. The notice asserted that my cabin extended onto community property by almost 50 feet and that my illegal occupation was a threat to safety and property values. It was bureaucratic intimidation, pure and simple, but it was effective. My stomach knotted with anxiety as I envisioned being forcibly removed from my grandfather's home at gunpoint. Later that afternoon, while examining the dock, I observed something peculiar. Fresh scratches marked the posts, and there were indications that several boats had been moored there recently. Did anyone use this dock while the cabin was unoccupied? I inquired of Shanley, who was tending to his garden. He scoffed. Oh, definitely. Doris has been leasing out prime lake access spots to weekend visitors for $200 a pop. Your dock is a coveted location, deep water, excellent fishing. She's likely earned thousands from it since your grandfather passed. My initial shock morphed into outrage. Not only were they attempting to seize my property, but they had also been profiting from it while my grandfather had barely been laid to rest. That evening, I scrutinized the eviction documents again. The attached property survey depicted boundaries that did not align with my recollections. Their map indicated my cabin encroached on HOA common land by nearly 50 feet, and the lakefront was not considered part of my property at all. Something was deeply amiss. As I was organizing the papers, I saw a folder that had slipped from the bookshelf. Its label, written in my grandfather's neat script, read, Pinewood Lake Original Survey, Keep Safe. Inside, I found a yellowed survey from 1963, property deeds, and a small journal. Why had my grandfather concealed these documents? And why did they delineate boundaries so drastically different from the HOA's assertions? The following morning, I went to town to duplicate everything I had discovered. My grandfather's papers indicated that his property reached all the way to the lake and encompassed nearly 70 feet of shoreline, substantially more than the HOA acknowledged. The journal held detailed notes on property lines, local rules, and what looked like a protracted disagreement with prior HOA leaders. My grandfather had been incredibly thorough, likely a result of his 40-year career as a land surveyor. The most telling entry was dated 5 years ago. New HOA President D. Clark visited today. Offered to purchase my lot for development. Price insultingly low. When I refused, she alluded to new community regulations on the horizon. Implied my property might soon be non-compliant. Taking precautions. This single notation shed so much light on the present circumstances. Upon my return to the cabin, a woman in her early 30s was inspecting my property line markers with a concerned expression. She was wearing hiking boots and holding a professional-looking camera. "May I help you?" I asked, immediately cautious after the previous day's encounter. She turned, looking surprised, then smiled and offered her hand. "You must be Carwin. I'm Era Finley, an environmental lawyer and your closest neighbor to the north. Shanley told me you were having issues with the HOA. I figured I should introduce myself, as we may be allies." Over coffee, Era recounted that she had relocated to Pinewood Lake 2 years prior after inheriting her aunt's cabin. Doris appeared a week after I moved in, asserting my dock was in violation of some new, arbitrary rule. When I noted it had been there for 30 years, she then claimed my shed was 6 inches over the property line and threatened a $10,000 fine. Her expression hardened. I resisted. Now she generally leaves me be, but concentrates on more vulnerable targets. Era perused my grandfather's documents, her eyebrows arching. "These original surveys are invaluable," she stated. "According to these, you own significantly more land than they admit, including the entire cove where the new community dock is being constructed." She tapped the survey with her finger. "Land boundaries cannot be altered without legal documentation. Either they possess more recent surveys that replace these, or they are attempting to steal your land." "Why would they target this particular property?" I inquired. Era's look became grave. "Location. Your lot provides the deepest water access and the finest view of the lake. Ideal for a luxury development." She gestured toward the distant shore where construction machinery was visible. "Doris's company is erecting high-end condos over there, but they require additional waterfront for their marina. Your grandfather wouldn't sell, so." She shrugged. "Create violations, force an eviction, and acquire the property for a fraction of its value at a distressed sale." That afternoon, a white SUV with Pinewood Lake HOA emblazoned on its side arrived. A woman with flawless blonde hair and a cream-colored suit emerged, accompanied by 2 men holding clipboards. I knew her from the community website, Doris Clark, HOA president and local real estate developer. She didn't waste time with introductions, heading straight for my deck to take photos. "Mr. Porter," she announced curtly, "we are performing our daily inspection. Your deck railing is in violation of safety codes, and that boat must be registered with the HOA. Additionally, we have installed security cameras for community safety." She indicated a small camera now fixed to a tree at the edge of what she asserted was my property line, aimed squarely at my cabin. I advanced, keeping a polite smile. "Miss Clark, I think there's some confusion regarding my property lines. I have the original surveys that show." She interrupted me with a dismissive gesture. "Those old documents were superseded long ago. The community has changed, Mr. Porter. If you had come to the annual meetings, you would be aware of that." She handed me a packet. "Here are our current regulations and a violation notice for unauthorized parking. That will be $200, due within 30 days. I held my ground. "I would like to see the documents that supersede my grandfather's original deed." For a fleeting moment, Doris's confident expression faltered. "That information is available at the HOA office during business hours." She recovered swiftly, her smile not touching her eyes. "I highly recommend you comply quickly, Mr. Porter." The fines increased daily. As they left, I saw one of her aides photographing my car, my boat, and even the bird feeder hanging from a tree. After their departure, I contacted the county assessor's office and learned that my grandfather had requested a comprehensive property reassessment just 6 months before he passed away. The results were not yet finalized, but would contain the most up-to-date official boundaries. I also found notes in his journal about Doris's efforts to purchase his property for a lakefront revitalization project, offers he had consistently rejected. That evening, I discreetly took pictures of several HOA board members walking across what my grandfather's documents confirmed was my land. As I delved deeper into the journal, I discovered a letter tucked inside the back cover. It was from my grandfather to me, written just weeks before his death. "Carwin," it began, "I resisted them as long as I was able, but I am too old and weary to go on. They will come for the property after I am gone. The truth lies in the surveys. Do not let them seize what is rightfully yours. I should have been stronger, but perhaps you can complete what I could not." The letter brought tears to my eyes. I remembered my grandfather as a powerful, principled man. The thought of him being ground down by relentless harassment in his last years filled me with a mix of grief and rage. The letter left me with a sense of emptiness and a renewed sense of purpose. Later that night, driven by curiosity about Doris's true intentions, I looked up her development company online. What I discovered sent a chill down my spine. Architectural mock-ups for Pinewood Lake Luxury, a massive development slated for the exact site of my cabin. The estimated revenue was over $2 million. Examining the development plans more closely, I understood why my property was so vital. The entire venture depended on controlling the cove where my dock was situated. It was the only section deep enough for the luxury yacht marina that was a key feature in their marketing. Without that access, the condos would lose their most significant selling point. I wasn't merely defending my cabin, I was an obstacle to Doris's multi-million-dollar enterprise. The next morning, a certified letter came from the county records office, arriving just as Doris's landscaping team was accidentally ruining my garden while maintaining community green spaces. When I tore open the envelope, I couldn't suppress a smile. Grandpa hadn't just been paranoid with all his surveys and paperwork. He had been laying the perfect trap. The letter from the county records confirmed my suspicions. My grandfather's final property assessment had been finished and officially filed 3 weeks before he died. The document clearly defined boundaries that corresponded with his original survey, not the HOA's assertions. It specifically stated that the Porter property at 67 Lakeview Drive extends to the natural shoreline with riparian rights to adjacent waters as established in the original 1963 deed. In essence, I not only owned the land down to the lake, but also held legal rights to the water access itself. Armed with official validation, I chose to attend the monthly HOA meeting that evening. The community center was a contemporary structure near the lake entrance, all glass and stone, designed to impress prospective buyers rather than serve the modest cabin community. Inside, about 30 people sat in orderly rows before a raised platform where Doris and 4 board members presided like a small-town governing body. I sat discreetly at the back, watching the proceedings. Doris conducted the meeting with brutal efficiency, shutting down questions and concerns with rehearsed ease. Several homeowners brought up issues about increasing fees and arbitrary rule enforcement, only to be informed their issues would be taken under advisement or handled in committee. When the floor was open for new business, I rose. I would like to address the board concerning the boundary dispute related to the Porter property at 67 Lakeview Drive. Doris's smile remained, but her eyes narrowed. Mr. Porter, property disputes are addressed through official channels, not in open meetings. Please submit your concerns in writing. I smiled back. Actually, per HOA Bylaw 7.3, members can raise boundary issues at open meetings if they affect community resources. Since you have claimed my dock as HOA property and have been leasing spaces to non-residents, this qualifies. I held up the county documents. I have official certification from the county assessor, Jordan Williams, confirming that my property extends to the lake and includes 70 feet of shoreline, which encompasses the area where you've been collecting dock rental fees. The room filled with murmurs. A thin man in a pricey suit, introduced as Douglas Price, the HOA's legal counsel, whispered urgently to Doris. I went on, ensuring my voice was audible at the back of the room. Furthermore, I have documented numerous instances of HO representatives trespassing on my property, destroying my garden, and installing surveillance equipment without permission. I am ready to press charges if needed, but I would rather settle this peacefully. Several homeowners turned to stare at Doris, whose composure had clearly fractured. She stood up abruptly. This meeting is now adjourned. We will look into Mr. Porter's claims and respond to them accordingly. As people filed out, several gave me nods of approval or whispered words of support. One elderly woman squeezed my arm and said, "It's high time someone stood up to her." The next morning, I found that my water and electricity had been disconnected. A notice on my door mentioned emergency infrastructure upgrades that would require 2 to 4 weeks to finish. When I contacted the utility companies, they told me the shutdown was requested by the HOA, which managed all service connections in the community. That afternoon, I went to town and bought solar panels, a water filtration system, and a small generator. If they intended to play unfairly, I needed to be self-reliant. Era helped me set up the solar panels, shaking her head at the HOA's methods. Doris did the same thing to the Hendersons last year when they wouldn't sell. They lasted 2 weeks without water before giving in. As we worked, she revealed something intriguing she had found. I've been looking into Doris's development plans. There are major environmental issues with that condo project, potential wetland damage that would never get through a proper environmental impact assessment. However, 3 of the 5 county commissioners who would approve the permits are investors in our company. That seems like a conflict of interest, I remarked, connecting wires to the battery system. Era nodded grimly. A classic case of small-town corruption. Most people lack the resources to challenge it. They either sell or are forced out. She passed me a wrench. But most people are not forensic accountants with environmental lawyers as neighbors. Over the subsequent days, I recorded every HOA transgression, the unauthorized camera on my land, the disconnection of services, the daily inspections that included taking pictures through my windows. I set up my own cameras, capturing board members deliberately crossing my property, testing my doors, and, in one instance, trying to peer through my windows. Each event was logged, timestamped, and added to my expanding file of evidence. That night, I drove to the county office and lodged formal complaints regarding the HOA's behavior, providing documentation of the boundary disagreement, utility cutoff, and harassment. On my way back, I purchased surveying stakes and property markers. At dawn, I placed them along my actual property line, which ran directly through what the HOA had termed their community garden and finished just a few feet from their treasured gazebo. I attached small, solar-powered lights to ensure they were visible after dark. The stakes were a deliberate challenge, and Doris's response was immediate. That afternoon, a courier brought a cease and desist letter that threatened legal action for vandalism of community property and malicious interference with HOA operations. The letter insisted I remove all stakes and cover the cost of damages, warning of a potential $50,000 lawsuit if I failed to comply within 24 hours. I was considering my next move when I heard a rumbling sound outside at 5 in the morning. A tow truck was preparing to haul away my car, which was parked in my own driveway. The driver presented HOA documents asserting that my vehicle was illegally parked in a community access area. I hurried out in my bathrobe, standing in the truck's path. "This is private property. You are committing theft." The driver appeared uneasy. "Look, buddy, I'm just following the paperwork. Take it up with the HOA." After a tense conversation and my threat to call the sheriff, he unhooked my car and departed. Standing in the early morning haze, watching the tow truck vanish, a phrase my grandfather wrote in his journal echoed in my mind. The best way to win a rigged game is to change the rules. And I had just found rule number 1 of my property deed, the one concerning water rights that would make Doris choke on her morning coffee. My grandfather's documents held a vital detail I had previously missed. The original deed specified riparian water rights to the entire cove beside my property. In straightforward terms, while I owned the physical shoreline, I also possessed the legal authority to manage access to the water in that vicinity. This implied that the enormous community dock built by the HOA, the core of Doris's rental enterprise and future condo project, was technically infringing on my water rights. I confirmed this with a local lawyer, who affirmed that Minnesota lake property laws were very clear about these rights. Your grandfather knew precisely what he was doing. These rights haven't been used, but they have never been relinquished either. With this knowledge, I paid a visit to Jeffrey Taylor, the harbor master in charge of lake structures and water access. He was doubtful initially, studying my documents with a frown. These rights haven't been exercised in decades, he stated, pushing up his glasses. But if the county assessor has verified your boundaries, then yes, technically that dock would require your consent to stay. He sighed. Miss Clark will not be pleased. That dock generates substantial income for the community. News travels quickly in a small town. By that evening, neighbors were stopping by, some inquisitive, some encouraging, and others clearly dispatched to gather information for Doris. An elderly couple expressed their gratitude for my stand against the HOA. They have been intimidating people for years, the husband whispered. Another neighbor cautioned me to be careful. Doris plays to win, and she has connections in the county government. The following day, I learned that Doris had arranged a community meeting without inviting me. Shanley went and later informed me that she had depicted me as a city dweller intent on wrecking community facilities and raising everyone's HOA fees. She apparently said, if he succeeds, we'll have to raise annual dues by 30% to make up for the lost dock revenue. The animosity was tangible when I walked through the community the next morning. Someone had spray-painted "Sell Out" on my mailbox, and I discovered nails strewn across my driveway. These attempts at intimidation only fortified my determination. In my career as a forensic accountant, I had encountered numerous bullies who employed financial coercion to achieve their goals. I devoted the next 2 days to researching water rights legislation and consulting with a water management authority. ERA delivered more troubling news. I've been examining the environmental impact documents for Doris's development. They claim minimal shoreline disruption, but their actual plans involve major dredging that would devastate fish habitats. They've submitted entirely different documents to different agencies. The papers for the tourism board depicted a massive marina that needed extensive dredging, whereas the environmental impact statement mentioned only minor shoreline enhancements. Douglas Price, the HOA lawyer, had approved the falsified documents. On Friday, I dispatched an official notice to the HOA about the dock's encroachment. Instead of demanding its removal, I proposed a fair licensing agreement. They could keep the dock in return for recognizing my property lines and paying a small annual fee. Doris's reaction was to schedule an emergency HOA board meeting. I went, equipped with all my evidence. The community center was full, the air thick with tension. Doris started with a character assassination, painting me as a greedy opportunist disrupting community peace. When I showed my evidence, including the riparian rights documentation, she brushed it off as outdated legal jargon and refused to even entertain the licensing agreement. Mr. Porter is trying to extort money from this community by using archaic language in a 60-year-old document, she announced. If we permit this, every homeowner with lake access will start charging their neighbors for water rights. Property values will crash. Weekend rentals will cease. Is that what all of you want? What occurred next caught everyone by surprise. Jeffrey Taylor, who had been sitting silently with the board members, abruptly rose. The documentation Mr. Porter has presented is valid, he declared, his voice firm with the authority of 20 years as harbor master. I have conferred with state water management, and his claim is sound. We should entertain his offer. Doris's face turned a deep red. You are out of order, Jeffrey. He shook his head, collected his papers, and walked out, stating clearly, No, Doris. You are out of order. and I refused to be a part of it any longer. The room buzzed with whispers. Several board members appeared uneasy. Doris hastily adjourned the meeting, but the harm had been done. As I walked back to my cabin that night, I saw 3 strange cars parked outside. What I did not anticipate was finding a crew of workers inside, removing my furniture and changing my locks. It seemed Doris had chosen to bypass the legal system altogether. A major error. A monumental error. I called the sheriff right away, but was informed they could not send anyone until the morning. Convenient, since Doris's husband had a regular Thursday poker game with the sheriff. With no place to sleep, I spent a restless night in my car, watching workers remove family heirlooms and personal items. They packed everything into storage containers marked Pinewood Development Corporation. Doris's company. By sunrise, new locks were on the doors, and a security guard stood watch. The guard, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, seemed uneasy with his task. "Just doing my job, sir," he said quietly when I came near. "Miss Clark says you're being evicted for numerous violations." I presented him with my property documents and the county's letter that explained the situation. His expression shifted. "Look, I'm just a summer employee. I don't know anything about property disputes." But then he lowered his voice. "They removed a lot of items last night, personal things. It didn't feel right to me." When the sheriff finally showed up, a full 18 hours after my call, he appeared indifferent to my documentation. "Seems like a civil issue to me," he said with a drawl. "HOA claims you're in violation. You claim you're not. The courts will have to resolve it." When I mentioned that breaking and entering was a criminal offense, he shrugged. "HOA bylaws grant them access rights in cases of violations. Take it to a judge." He departed, leaving me stranded and without a home. I attempted to contact several local attorneys, but none would accept my case. Conflict of interest, they all claimed, which I later discovered meant they were either employed by Doris or feared opposing her. I felt cornered. Without access to my cabin or belongings, with the community against me and local law enforcement unwilling to intervene, my choices were disappearing. For the first time, I thought about surrendering. I called my mother in tears, something I hadn't done since my divorce 5 years before. "Perhaps it's time to let it go, Carwin," she suggested gently. "Your grandfather wouldn't want you to endure this. You could sell the property to them and put it behind you." Her words struck me deeply. Was I being obstinate? Was this struggle truly worth it? I sat in my car, with the few belongings I had managed to retain, feeling completely beaten. That afternoon, Era discovered me at the local diner, gazing into a cold coffee cup. "You're staying with me tonight," she stated firmly. No discussion. She took me to her cabin, where Shanley and several other neighbors were waiting. "We are not going to let Doris succeed with this," one woman declared resolutely. "She tried similar tactics with my brother last year." Shanley nodded. "Your grandfather fought her too, son. She wore him down. But you don't have to follow that same path." Over bowls of homemade stew, they recounted their own experiences with Doris's intimidation. One family had been fined repeatedly for having too many garden plants until they finally sold to her company at a loss. An elderly widower had his driveway blocked by maintenance vehicles repeatedly until he gave up and moved to a retirement home. Each story followed the same pattern: systematic harassment followed by below-market purchase offers from Doris's development company. "Why has no one taken this to the authorities?" I asked. The awkward silence was telling. "She has half the county officials in her pocket," Shanley finally admitted. "And the other half is too afraid to challenge her. Her husband's family has deep roots here. Old money, old influence. But things are changing. People are getting tired of it." Shanley handed me a small package. "George left this with me before he passed. He said to give it to you if you ever ran into trouble with the HOA." Inside was an old wall clock and a note in my grandfather's handwriting. "Sometimes you need to see what's happening when you're not there to watch." Upon closer inspection of the clock, I found it housed a hidden camera, ingeniously designed to record a room's activities without being noticed. "Your grandfather was always 3 steps ahead," Shanley remarked with a sad smile. "He knew they'd eventually come for the property. He started collecting evidence years ago, but his health gave out before he could use it. He was saving it for you." The image of my grandfather meticulously preparing for this fight, knowing he wouldn't be alive to see it through, filled me with both sorrow and resolve. That night, after a shower and a proper meal, I read more of my grandfather's journal, finding that Doris had employed similar strategies against him: harassment, fabricated violations, and eventually, utility disconnections. The last entries depicted a man exhausted by the relentless conflict. "I'm too old to continue this fight," he had written. "But I have left everything. Carwin will need to see this through if he chooses to stand his ground." The words felt like a physical impact. My grandfather hadn't surrendered. He had been setting the stage for me to take over the battle. I slammed my fist on the table, startling Era, who was working close by. "Enough!" I exclaimed. "They did this to him, but they will not do it to me." The defeat I had felt morphed into a fiery determination. I was finished with being reactive. It was time to launch an attack. The following morning, I sought an emergency injunction against the HOA, alleging illegal eviction, breaking and entering, and theft of personal property. Era leveraged her legal network to secure a hearing within 48 hours. Meanwhile, neighbors started to come forward with statements detailing Doris's bullying methods and financial misconduct. I discovered that many residents had endured similar harassment but had been too frightened to speak out. Leveraging my accounting expertise, I started to scrutinize the HOA financial statements that Shanley had amassed over the years. The figures were inconsistent. Community fees had risen by nearly 200% in 3 years, yet spending on infrastructure had declined. Large amounts were labeled as administrative expenses without any detailed breakdown. Most questionable were routine transfers to a community development fund that seemed to finance no actual community initiatives. We figured out why Doris was so desperate to get my property. Her development company was heavily in debt, having overcommit on several unsuccessful ventures. The Pinewood Lake condos were her final opportunity to stave off bankruptcy. She had already pre-sold multiple units based on the promise of exclusive lake access that went directly through my land. "She's basically operating a Ponzi scheme," I explained to Era and Shanley, "using funds from new investors to offset losses from earlier projects. If the condo development fails, the entire structure will collapse." Era nodded grimly. "That clarifies the growing desperation. She's not just being avaricious. She's fighting for her survival." While awaiting the hearing, I launched a website detailing all the HOA's violations and my property claims, sharing it with every homeowner. I installed motion-activated sprinklers along my property line, accompanied by legal, no trespassing signs. I positioned my grandfather's clock camera to monitor my cabin, and as expected, it captured Doris and her team returning repeatedly to take more items and sift through personal papers. The most damning evidence was footage of Doris telling workers to search for property documents while they removed family photos and heirlooms, items of no monetary value, only sentimental to me. "Take anything that seems important," she was recorded saying. "I want this place completely emptied before he can get back in." It was the definitive proof we needed. Clear evidence of malicious intent, not legitimate HOA enforcement. The judge at our hearing was at first dismissive, but the video evidence of Doris's unlawful entry altered everything. He granted a temporary restraining order against the HOA, prohibiting them from accessing my property or tampering with my utilities. Crucially, he mandated that I be given immediate access to my cabin. The sheriff's department, now compelled by a court order, had to escort me back to my property that very afternoon. The expression on the security guard's face when the sheriff came to lead me back to my property was invaluable, but it paled in comparison to Doris's look the next morning when she saw what was bobbing in the lake. The dock sections I had legally detached overnight, with all their high-priced boats now crammed awkwardly into the public marina. News of my legal win and the dramatic dock removal spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been too scared to voice their opinions began to connect, sometimes with a brief nod at the general store or a quiet "good job" at the gas station. The barrier of intimidation was beginning to crumble. Daniel Atkins, an HOA board member who had consistently sided with Doris, contacted me in secret. "I can't be seen with you publicly," he whispered over coffee at a diner 20 miles from Pinewood Lake. "But I've been uneasy with Doris's tactics for a long time. I have some documents you need to see." His hands trembled as he handed me a manila envelope. The documents Daniel gave me showed years of financial malpractice. Doris had been channeling HOA funds into her development company, masking the transfers as community improvements. Maintenance fees had been gathered but never used for actual upkeep, which explained the poor condition of the roads and common areas despite increasing HOA dues. Most damningly, she had forged board meeting minutes to authorize actions that were never actually voted on. The development company is on the verge of bankruptcy, Daniel said. They've been using HOA fees to make payroll for months. If that information gets out, she could face criminal charges. Meanwhile, Doris was becoming frantic. My security cameras recorded her trespassing multiple times, once trying to plant fabricated evidence of code violations on my property. She filed a countersuit filled with baseless allegations, including that I had threatened HOA members and damaged community property. During a confrontation at the grocery store, her hand shook with fury as she hissed, "You don't know who you're up against. I will ruin you." Despite her threats, public sentiment was turning. Jeffrey Taylor provided comprehensive records of dock rental fees that were never reflected in HOA financial statements. Several board members started to challenge Doris's decisions in public forums. Even the sheriff began to answer my calls. I concentrated on restoring my cabin, fixing the damage from the illegal eviction. As I worked on replacing broken windows and repainting graffitied walls, neighbors started to drop by to offer help. An unplanned weekend work party took shape, with a dozen people arriving with tools, lumber, and food. During this period, Era and I became closer, passing evenings on her porch developing strategies. She had come to Pinewood Lake for tranquility after years of environmental law work in Chicago, only to be drawn into another conflict. "Some fights find you," she remarked one night, her hand briefly resting on mine. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you're resisting, not just for your own sake, but for everyone she's intimidated." To foster goodwill, I hosted a lakeside barbecue, inviting all neighbors, regardless of their allegiances. As people mingled over food and drinks, they shared their own HOA horror stories. An elderly couple fined for a bird feeder, a single mother's car towed from her own driveway for being unregistered. With every story, the community's animosity toward Doris solidified. "We need to take back our community," I announced to the assembled neighbors. "The HOA is supposed to work for us, not against us." I witnessed a powerful new energy emerging, a sense of shared purpose. Pinewood Lake had been a cluster of isolated homeowners, each confronting Doris alone. Now they were transforming into a united community. Through Daniel, I found out that several board members were prepared to oppose Doris. I drafted a detailed settlement proposal. I would retain my rightful property and permit the HOA to license dock space through a formal legal agreement, with the fees directed toward actual community enhancements instead of Doris's personal gain. The proposal also included transparency protocols to prevent future abuses. The decisive moment arrived when the State Environmental Authority, acting on information Era had supplied, suspended all development permits pending an inquiry into falsified environmental impact statements. Doris's company's stock nosedived, and investors began to withdraw from the condo project. At the subsequent HOA meeting, which Doris tried and failed to cancel, several board members openly challenged her leadership. "We've received disturbing reports about financial discrepancies," one elderly board member stated. "The community is owed transparency about how our fees are being used." When Doris tried to adjourn without addressing the issues, the homeowners refused to budge. For the first time, the community stood united against her intimidation. Daniel messaged me during the meeting. "Emergency board session called for 7 p.m. tomorrow. She's trying to approve a legal fund to fight you. Time to bring everything you've got." That night, I meticulously organized my evidence: financial records, video clips, witness statements, and proof of Doris's systematic harassment of multiple homeowners. As I worked, I felt my grandfather's spirit, as if he were guiding my actions. "This is for you, Grandpa," I whispered. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. precisely. I was not invited, naturally, but thanks to Daniel's text messages, I knew the perfect moment to show up with my final piece of evidence, the one that would bring Doris's entire operation crashing down around her designer suit. I timed my arrival flawlessly, stepping into the community center just as Doris was imploring the board to authorize a special assessment, an extra $3,000 per household to finance legal proceedings against me. The room grew quiet as I walked to the podium, holding a thick folder and a small projector. "Before you decide on that assessment," I said steadily, "you might want to see what your HOA president has been doing with your funds." Doris attempted to have me ejected, but board members insisted I be heard. "We have been listening to Mr. Porter's accusations for weeks," one stated firmly. "It's time we examined his evidence." Doris's expression tightened, but she was outnumbered. I connected my projector and started to present my case. Financial records indicating systematic embezzlement, forged meeting minutes, and correspondence with developers that exposed her scheme to oust original homeowners and transform the entire lakeshore into luxury condominiums. I showed side-by-side documents illustrating how HOA funds had been methodically redirected to Doris's development company over the past 3 years. I detailed how nearly $700,000 in community fees had been moved to Pinewood Development Corporation disguised as infrastructure improvements that were never carried out. Stunned murmurs rippled through the room as homeowners grasped the extent of the manipulation. But the most damning evidence was a recording from my grandfather's clock camera, showing Doris and the HOA lawyer scheming to invent violations to drive me out. "We need the property for the marina," Doris's voice said on the recording. "I don't care what violations you need to invent. Just get rid of him. The investors are breathing down my neck." The lawyer's reply was just as incriminating. "We've already pushed the legal limits. Breaking in could lead to criminal charges." Doris's dismissive laugh was chilling. "Who's going to charge us? My husband plays poker with the sheriff every Thursday." As the evidence piled up, Doris's face went from flushed to pale. When I played a recording of her instructing workers to change my locks and seize my belongings, a clear criminal offense, she suddenly jumped to her feet. "You ungrateful people," she shrieked, her carefully crafted composure shattering completely. "I have supported this community for years. Those dilapidated cabins were depressing property values. My development would have made you all wealthy." In her fury, she made a critical error. Once the luxury condos are built, property values will triple, driving out all the riffraff who can't afford to live in a premium community. That was the intention all along. Her voice resonated in the shocked silence as everyone understood she had just confessed to intentionally trying to displace longtime residents for personal gain. Someone was filming on their phone, and Doris's outburst went viral on the community message boards within minutes. The board promptly held a vote of no confidence, removing her as president by a unanimous vote. They also voted to halt all eviction actions against me and other homeowners and to commission a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. As Doris exited, shouting threats of lawsuits and retaliation, the mood in the room changed. Neighbors who had been silenced for years were now talking freely, expressing relief, and even sharing laughter. It felt as though a heavy shadow had been lifted from Pinewood Lake. Daniel Atkins was appointed interim president with a clear mission to overhaul the HOA bylaws and reinstate transparency. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of Doris's machinations came to light. The county prosecutor launched an investigation into charges of fraud and embezzlement. Her development company went bankrupt as investors pulled out and loans were recalled. The luxury condo project was permanently canceled. The most gratifying part was seeing Doris's expensive furniture being loaded into moving trucks as she was forced to sell her lake house to pay for escalating legal fees. The new HOA leadership, with Daniel Atkins as interim president, collaborated with homeowners to create fair and transparent regulations. My property lines were officially acknowledged, and I was compensated for damages and stolen items. Jeffrey Taylor was tasked with overseeing a new dock sharing system that served the entire community instead of enriching one individual. The recovery was not instantaneous. Many homeowners had incurred financial losses from Doris's schemes, and the community's image had been tarnished. But an extraordinary thing grew out of the turmoil, a true sense of community. Neighbors who had once been isolated started collaborating on improvement projects. The community center, once Doris's stronghold, transformed into a genuine meeting place, with weekly potlucks and game nights. At a lakeside gathering to celebrate the new era at Pinewood Lake, I found myself unexpectedly in the limelight when Daniel invited me to speak. Standing before neighbors who had evolved from strangers into allies, I introduced the Pinewood Property Owners Protection, a set of binding bylaws designed to prevent any future HOA from abusing its authority or targeting individual homeowners. The proposal was approved with overwhelming support. My grandfather cherished this lake, I shared with the assembled community. He fought to safeguard his small portion of it, but he envisioned something greater, a community where homeowners collaborated instead of clashing, where rules were in place to protect what makes this place special, not to force people out. I pointed toward the sunset, which was painting the lake in shades of golden crimson. This is what he was fighting for, what we all fought for. In the months that followed, I chose to make the cabin my permanent home, turning my city condo into a rental. Working alongside ERA and environmental specialists, we designated the shoreline around my property as a protected conservation area, ensuring its preservation for future generations. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very land Doris had intended to pave over with concrete and glass would now stay natural indefinitely. Perhaps most significantly, we founded the Pinewood Legal Defense Fund to assist homeowners in challenging HOA overreach, not just at our lake but throughout the county. The fund, initiated with the settlement from my case against the former HOA, would guarantee that no one would have to endure such struggles alone. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Shanley remarked one evening as we fished from my rebuilt dock. "He always said you possessed the porter's stubbornness." It turns out that was precisely what this situation required. Era and I became closer as we collaborated on community initiatives. What started as a partnership against a shared adversary evolved into something more profound. 6 months after Doris's downfall, Era relocated her environmental law practice to a small office in town and became a constant presence at my cabin. We merged our talents, her legal expertise and my accounting skills, to help other communities create fair HOA policies. A year later, we hosted a community celebration at my cabin. The new dock sharing system was operating flawlessly, with fair fees financing rail improvements. Neighbors who were once cowed into silence were now active voices in community matters. Children played on the shoreline that had almost become a concrete marina, and longtime residents shared tales of Pinewood Lake's past with new arrivals. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water my grandfather had fought to defend, I offered a toast to his memory. The cabin that had nearly been lost had become the center of a revitalized community. Sometimes, holding your ground is not just about safeguarding what belongs to you. It's about building something better for everyone. Well, everyone except Doris, who I'm told is now managing a mini-mall in Nevada. I did, however, send her a housewarming present, a beautifully framed copy of my property survey. I figured she might want to hang it as a reminder to always read the fine print.